In this video, I'm going to show you how to place the rear brakes on this Subaru Crosstrek. Let's get started. Let's remove the wheel. Use a 19mm socket, remove all 5 lug nuts, and then pull the wheel off. Use a 14mm wrench or socket and remove the 2 bolts that connect the caliper onto the slider pins and therefore onto the bracket. These shouldn't be very tight. Once you break them free, they should come out easily by hand. There's one and the other. Before I completely pull the caliper off, I'm going to pop the bleeder screw and with a 10mm wrench, crack this free and then snug it back up a little so fluid doesn't leak, because the next step, once this is off, is going to be compressing the caliper piston, and I'm going to have the bleeder screw open for this. It's a lot easier to crack it free with the caliper mounted so it doesn't want to twist on you. I have this lever pump style caliper depressor tool, but if you have the twist style that has a long threaded rod, that works just fine. All you need is to very gently and slowly push back this piston. So I have my tool set up in here, and before I start pressing, I'm going to open up the bleeder screw once again with that 10mm wrench or socket, but I recommend a wrench because the socket will fill up with brake fluid. Okay, so keep that open. Watch out because brake fluid will come out of here, and if you go quickly, it'll shoot straight out. I have a collection bucket catching all of this fluid, and I'm very, very slowly pushing this piston back, and it just bottomed out. So that's perfect. If it's very difficult to push back, that most likely means the caliper piston is seizing up internally and you will need a new caliper. I'm going to wait until there's no more air coming out of this bleeder screw, and it looks like the air bubbles just stopped. I'm going to give it another 5 seconds or so. As you can see, another air bubble there. You don't want air trapped in the hydraulic system. Once you're sure that it's good, close it off. And when you tighten this, you really don't need to tighten it a lot. You just need to give it a quick snug, at most 1/8 of a turn after it bottoms out, if even that. You don't want to break it or strip it out. Now there is brake fluid on here, so we're going to have to rinse that off with some brake parts cleaner. Once you have this rinsed off and dried, cap the bleeder screw back up so that it doesn't clog up with debris over time, and put the caliper on top of the upper control arm. You don't want it pulling on the brake hose by letting it hang. Remove the pads by prying them out. If they're stuck, you can use a pry bar to help you out. These are not stuck, so that's great. Now let's remove the 2 17mm bolts holding the caliper bracket onto the knuckle so that we can pull the rotor off and of course get this on the bench and clean it. Once again, 17mm, break it free, and then remove it. Before you take this one out completely, break free the top one. And this one, and the bracket. Now remove the rotor. If it's stuck, it could be seized on the hub, or of course make sure your parking brake is not engaged, because then that's going to hold the rotor completely stuck on here without it being seized. So mine moves freely. I'm going to remove that. Out of the original rotor, you want to save this rubber plug. It's easiest if you just pop it out from the inside. This is going to cover up the hole that you can use to adjust the parking brake shoes with the rotor on, but you want to transfer it over to the new rotor. It does not come with it, otherwise water can get in here and rust out your parking brake and your parking brake hardware. Install it on the new rotor. Press it in all the way. Make sure it's actually fully seated and locked in. There we go. If you're not going to replace your parking brake shoes, it is a good idea to inspect everything. Make sure the shoe material, the braking material, is still properly mounted on here. Sometimes they actually come off. The bonding fails and the shoe separates. These are all in great shape. If you notice that they're very crunchy and squeaky when you move them, you can lubricate on the back sides here, here, and here, right on between the shoe and the backing shield where it touches, and of course right at the pivot point. Mine are all in great shape and they were adjusted properly before, so of course we're going to check the adjustment when I put this on, but these should be good to go. I will give them a quick cleaning with brake parts cleaner to remove all the dust, but once again, when you do brakes and you have parking brake shoes like this, it's a good idea to at least inspect them. Before I clean those, I'm also going to take a look at the hub. This one looks like it's actually been recently replaced, so there's no rust on it. It's actually still painted from the factory. There's just a little bit of anti-seize, which I'm going to just use a wire brush to get off of here, or at least as much as I can. And then I will just use brake parts cleaner to do the rest. It's going to melt it off. Now, if yours had rust, you're going to want to use a wire brush. If it's light, if it's severe, you're going to want to use some sandpaper or a sanding disc to get it nice and clean. You don't want a lot of rot buildup here because the rotor won't sit flat. And if it doesn't sit flat, you'll have braking issues, and you don't want your brake pedal pulsating just because of this. Of course, the wheel isn't going to sit perfectly flat on that either. So I'm going to put a collection bucket underneath, rinse everything, including the shoes and the hub, with brake parts cleaner, get it all cleaned up, and then we'll go from there. Apply a thin layer of anti-seize to the surface of the hub. You don't need a lot. If you put too much, it'll start flinging out as you drive. You just want to prevent corrosion. I know this hub still has some paint on it, but I still like to add this anti-corrosive coating. It'll also prevent the rotor from seizing onto the hub or building up rust to the point where it swells up. And if it swells up, it'll push off the hub and it's not going to sit flat anymore. Once again, a nice thin layer all around will do the trick. The new rotors should be cleaned off. Even if they have this special coating that is not an oil-based coating, you should clean off any fingerprints or oils that may have gotten on it. So spray it down with a little bit of brake parts cleaner. Take a clean rag and wipe it off, as well as inside the hat of the rotor where the parking brake shoes grab. Now slide the rotor on. Let's clean off the outside. Parking brake shoes were set right before, but let's check them. Press on the rotor. I don't feel any drag, and you can barely just hear them touch at times, and then it kind of goes away. That's what you want out of parking brake shoes. You don't want them to drag like drum brakes, but you do want them to be close. Otherwise, the handle, as you pull it, is going to go all the way up and potentially not even hold the vehicle. So this is adjusted properly. If you do need to adjust them, you can either go through this hole right here that we plugged. At the bottom, there's an adjuster, or you can, of course, pull it off and do it then. Now let's clean up the caliper bracket. And the first thing I'm going to do is remove the anti-rattle clips. The old one, we're going to set them aside, and we want to clean right underneath here where they mount, on both sides of course. Typically you can take a wire brush and just clean off the area. If it's extremely corroded and dirty, you need a sanding disc or a wire wheel on a drill. Looks like the wire brush is cleaning things up really nicely for me, so this is what I'm going to use. The surface rust is minimal. Now if you see grooves like this is actually from someone using a sanding disc that was way too abrasive. And if you do that, you can actually remove too much material by accident. That's going to make it so the anti-rattle clips don't mount properly, so try to avoid doing that. If your caliper bracket is severely corroded, it's better to sand longer with a finer sanding disc or sandpaper or a file even, as opposed to something really coarse that'll get the job done quick but could potentially remove way too much material. And as you can see, for me, the wire brush did the trick very nicely. We're going to do the same on the other side. It's also important to clean right in between here so that the anti-rattle clips don't get bound up, or if you have a lot of buildup, the rotor can actually hit the buildup and make horrible scraping noises. This one is fairly rusty, so that's why I'm cleaning here. You may not always have to, but I recommend at least checking. Once you have those areas cleaned up, use brake parts cleaner to rinse it off. You don't need a lot, just a little bit to get any oils and debris and dust off. And with that done, apply a very thin layer of brake grease or silicone paste that is rated for high temperatures to the entire area that you cleaned up. If this was applied prior, the rust would not have been there because this is actually a rust inhibitor, of course. It's grease. Now you don't want a lot on either side here. You just want a thin layer. It will protect, but if you put too much, it'll actually squeeze out when you put the anti-rattle clips on. and it could get onto the rotor, and that's obviously something you want to avoid. You do not want grease on your braking surface. Once you've coated this entire area, take the anti-rattle clips and drop them down. They should lock into place. Flip it over. Do the same over here. Just like that. Now let's clean the slider pins and re-lubricate them. If they're seized and stuck, you're going to have to work them out. And if they don't come out, you might need a new caliper bracket. Once you take this one out, wipe it off with a rag, and you'll notice that one of them, oops, this just came off, and this is what I was going to point out, they have one of these sleeves, this rubber sleeve here. It is important that it stays in the bore that it came out of, so I'm going to do these one at a time. Now there's no rust on these, which is great. Sometimes when the boots fail, or if there's improper lubrication in here, they rust right at the edge here where the boot is, or all throughout, and seize up. And my grease in here is still good, so I'm not worried about flushing this whole thing out. What I will do is take a little bit of fresh grease and add it in there. This will act as a reserve of grease, and I'm going to put the rest on the slider pin. You can't put too much on the slider pin anyway because it'll just get wiped off as you install this. And up at the edge here on the lip where the boot seals up, slide it through. All right, press that slider pin in. If you have air that's trapped in there that's trying to push it out, what you can do is hold it, and squeeze the boot. That should release most, if not all, of the air that's trapped back there. Wipe off any excess grease, flip it over, and do this side. Now this one you'll notice is just a straight metal pin, flat. Does not have any sort of bushings on it or sleeves or anything. And this one is also in very good condition, so I'm not worried about it. I'm just going to wipe it off. Wipe off a little bit of the grease that's in here, and then pack it with new grease, and call this done. Take a little pocket screwdriver. There we go. Pry that boot out while you squeeze. That's going to push out the air as well as any excess grease that is trapped in there. And this caliper bracket is now ready to be put back on the vehicle. Have your bolts ready. Slide the caliper bracket over. Start it on. Get the bolts started. Snug them up. The torque for these two is 81 foot-pounds. Install the pads. The inner one is going to have a wear indicator. Sometimes the wear indicator is only on one side, left or right. Doesn't matter which side you put it on as long as it's on the inside of the bracket where the piston pushes on the pad. Slide these in and they should slide on nice and smooth. If they bind up, that likely means you have corrosion, excessive rust buildup in the bracket, and they're getting crushed together and they cannot move. They should move so that they can free up the rotor when you're not on the brakes. Now take your caliper, slide it over the pads. Make sure the slider pins allow it to go over fully, and start in the two 14mm bolts holding the caliper onto the bracket. Bottom these out. The torque for these is pretty low. It's 20 foot-pounds, so make sure that if you're using a power tool to bottom them out, you don't go too tight. Let's get the wheel back on. Start on all 5 lug nuts, bottom them out in a cross pattern, and also in a cross pattern, torque them to 89 foot-pounds. Once again, 89 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. Double check them. At this point, you can do the same to the other side. Pump up that brake pedal, top off the master cylinder, and take it for a road test.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.